Welcome to episode 5 of the Victory Podcast. And I am your host, Monique Watson. And in this episode, we'll talk a bit with two of my friends. One is a new friend, one's a friend I've known for quite some time. We'll start off with Carolyn, talking a bit about her career, and she's the host of as well. And then we'll talk to Christine Alexis, who is a social media manager. She'll talk a bit about that and getting into social media management and even her struggles as she's dealt with having a speech impediment. So stay tuned and thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned and thank you so much for listening. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on when you're listening to this. Welcome to the Victory Podcast. I'm your host, Monique Watson, and I have our special guest, Carolyn Kiel. Is that how you say your last name?
That's perfect.
Okay.
That's perfect.
Okay, cool. I was just taking a guess, stab in the dark. So Carolyn is joining us from Beyond 6 Seconds podcast, and we found each other a bit on the Lady Pod Squad Facebook group, and I was looking for more guests, and she said, I would love to be on your podcast, and here she is.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Woohoo! So just to give our listeners a little outline of what this podcast episode is going to structure around, we'll get a little bit of background of Carolyn, of herself, however she feels comfortable sharing, a little insight into how she got into the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast, some of her tips and tricks. And I brought my notebook because I'm an early newbie podcaster. So you've got several episodes under your belt. And then she'll be sharing maybe a personal story and some her challenges that maybe she came across and how she was able to overcome, and maybe some advice to others. And then we'll wrap up. Wrap up on how you can find Beyond 6 Seconds podcasts on the social media and the websites and all the good things, and bring it on home. So, Carolyn, tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I am an employee training manager. At a large Fortune 500 company in New Jersey. That's my full-time gig. That's my main career there. I grew up in Westchester County, New York, which is about, I'd say, less than 1 hour north of New York City. So I went to college in New York State, and then moved to New Jersey after I got married, which was just about 12 years ago. So that's where my husband and I are living today. I studied psychology in college and in grad school, although there was quite a gap of time in between the two degrees. And podcasting, I'm also a musician. Most recently, I have been an a cappella singer pretty much since my college days. And although I'm not currently singing, I decided I'm going to try using my voice for a different type of project. And that's really what led me to start podcasting about 2 years ago. And that's sort of the main thing that keeps me busy now is my outside of my job and family and all other things in life is my podcast, Beyond 6 Seconds.
Awesome. That's really cool. Lots of interesting bits there. Yeah, lots of interesting bits there. Yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, as I mentioned in the kind of outline, we met through the Lady Pod Squad Facebook group. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really good resource for those, especially ladies, yeah. Who are interested in getting a lot of good information and best practice sharing and tips and tricks in there. So maybe you can what kind of led you down, maybe a couple things, maybe give our listeners a kind of overview of what your podcast is about, how you got into doing the podcasting side. And you mentioned the style of your podcast is in line and similar to this podcast, and kind of what led you down that path.
Sure. So a little bit about my podcast. It's called Beyond 6 Seconds, and it's about the really extraordinary stories of everyday people who are overcoming challenges to achieve their goals, shape their careers, and overall make the world a brighter and better place. So it's an interview style podcast. I interview a new person in each episode. My guests come from all walks of life, really. They have leadership qualities, but they could be they have leadership qualities, but they could be anyone from community volunteers to solopreneurs to creative artists and musicians, and all the way up to former Fortune 500 CEOs. And I've had a celebrity or two recently, which is pretty exciting. So but really the common bond between all those stories is that I really try to provide a place on my podcast where people can feel that they can share their stories very candidly and just talk openly about the challenges that they've either faced to get to the success that they're currently having, or in some cases, a lot of people are right. Well, I guess we're all in the middle of our journeys, but some people are right in the middle of making that dream happen for themselves. So they just talk very realistically about what it's like. So it's a lot of the stuff that you don't see on social media. We usually only see like the end product, the end success, and then it always looks easy to everyone else, or we just see sort of, I guess, negative stuff on the other end. But this is just the real stuff. I really wanted to know what people were going through to to achieve their successes. Yeah. So in terms of how I got started, as I mentioned, I have been an a cappella singer for many years. I wound up, stopping that a couple of years ago for a variety of reasons. Part of it was honestly the time commitment. I was performing in New York City a lot. I'm out in New Jersey. It was just with work and with everything else going in my life at that time. It just got difficult to make the time commitment. So I was kind of without a creative outlet for a while. And then I sort of got into podcasts, I would say probably like in 2017 before I started this one, which I guess I was kind of late to the game because I guess podcasts have been around since like 2004. I don't know. But I just sort of became aware of them about, right before I started this, and thought they were an interesting way to learn information and hear from different voices and different types of people. And then I realized that, when I was in the singing group, I used to do some audio recording and audio editing. So I already kind of knew a little bit about microphones and a little bit about editing software. And I thought, well, maybe I could translate that over and do podcasting instead of singing. So I'm like, well, what am I going to podcast about? So I, at the same time, had several friends, acquaintances, social media, but it's like business to business career stuff. And people were sharing their stories online, but then I would talk to people, I would get to know them, message them, have conversations. And some people were really going through amazing challenges and still doing this incredible work. But no one was knowing about it because they were. And I said, I know so many amazing people. It would be great to just like get them on a show and just let them tell their story. And I could maybe, I could learn how to interview people better and improve my own skills and my, how to shape that story together. So I tried out, asked a couple friends from LinkedIn, like kind of nice to start out with friends, because I figured if I forgot to hit record or something, they wouldn't be mad at me, or something. It wouldn't be a big deal. So those episodes went really well. And then, as I released episodes in my first year, I think that was the beginning of 2018, I just started getting new guests to me and other people asking to come on my platform and tell their stories. And some people were telling their stories like literally for the first time ever. They're like, I really want to come on and just share this challenge that I never talk about with anyone, and I want to come on your show. I'm like, wow, it's like a huge honor. So
yeah,
I'm like, wow, it's like a huge honor. So
yeah,
I really try to honor what people are sharing with that. And then it just kind of, it took off from there, and I'm still doing it 2 years later.
Wow. Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, similar-ish as far as the style of this emerged, and I think I can't remember which, if any of the podcast, I think I laid out on the first one kind of the structure and where it came from. But yeah, people, I don't know, I think I'm just really approachable, and so sometimes really early on and almost scarily so, people will be like, with working on or problems they're having or deeply personal stories. And I just felt like a lot of those, like you said, in social media, you do definitely see one side or the other. You see the success or you see kind of the thick of it, but not the kind of the connection points along the way. So definitely similar mind meld on yeah, that's really cool. So what advice would you have? So I think I mentioned, I took a couple of notes while you were talking, just some of the asking your friends if you're getting started in the podcast space. Um, what other advice would you say? Okay, so and so, I'm Susie Q and I am thinking of starting, I'm Susie Q and I am thinking of starting a podcast. How do I get started? What are your tips? You're a year plus into it, 2 years almost.
Gosh, let's see. So I think probably the most fundamental tip I could give in terms of, I hear from I hear from a lot of people who post on social media and a lot of the podcasting groups about people, wanting to start a podcast, but maybe not knowing what they want to cover. Or I think really a lot of people have an idea, but they're nervous about starting a podcast in that because and maybe that's I tend to hear that more from women, honestly, than men who are a little bit nervous about sharing their voices. I would just say, as someone who kind of jumped into it and, because interviewing people, it's not like the most unique concept in the world. There are other personality, the way that you ask questions, the types of guests that you have on and the conversations you have with them. Those are different from any other podcast that's out there. So in terms of really, if you want to start a podcast, I would just start with your why. And even as basis, like, why do you want a podcast? If, do you have an idea that you're really passionate? Like, why do you want a podcast? If, do you have an idea that you're really passionate about and excited about, or particular cause, or something that you feel almost called to do through podcasting? And then kind of connect with that energy and whatever's driving you behind it. That doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out. I mean, certainly you can change your mind. That doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out. I mean, certainly you can change your mind. As your goals change, as you try things out, and maybe you don't like how something else is working, so you tweak it, and then you kind of learn what works for you along the way. But I find it's always important to know what drives you, because I mean, I'm sure, as you know, in work, it takes more time than you'll realize going into it, and you need that connection to your drive and your why to keep you going through the times that are hard work, time consuming, maybe frustrating. You don't always hear feedback right away from people, and sometimes it's like, is anybody listening to what I'm saying? Too frustrated or overwhelmed, because it can be a lot. But I think as long as you remember why you're doing it, I think that helps kind of balance things out and keep you focused as a podcaster. So that's kind of one basic thing. I could probably go on for a ton of time. I have so many tips. I could probably go on for a ton of time. I have so many tips. Like, there's just, it's such a learning experience with podcasting. And I would say, I know sometimes people worry about getting it exactly right and launching with the right concept and the perfect title and all this, but I've just used it. I just kind of picked the title was like the last thing that I picked for, I just kind of picked the title was like the last thing that I picked for my show. And I'm like, this is just the one that's jumping out at me. The Beyond 6 Seconds refers to like a study I had read online. It was like a job related study the finding was that this, recruiters only look at your resume for about 6 seconds, what your skills are and what your story is. Do they move you forward? So I just ran with that. I don't even know how valid the study is, but I thought Beyond 6 Seconds was a cool name. So I decided to do that. But even with that, just kind of, do your best, get something out there and just get started. You can always use it to learn new things, to make changes. Done is better than perfect kind of comes to mind. Like, just sort of get out there and start doing it. And, nobody's perfect on the first try with podcasts, not even the professionals. So I definitely encourage people to get out there.
For sure. I concur. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing is, as far as like from a really tactical perspective is probably investing a little bit in a decent microphone, because like if the audio quality it doesn't have to be like fantastic, like we're professionals, but at least should be somewhat stick like we're professionals, but at least should be somewhat okay, especially for an interview style where both people, I know like my first episode, I used a different mic because I was traveling and it was a little bit easier to transport, but the quality was worse. And I was like, never doing that again, invest in the time to get the better mic with me. So the biggest from a real tactical standpoint. But yeah, there's so many good tools for audio editing that don't require a lot of my background is nothing with audio editing before really doing this podcast, but like the different free applications that exist and all that. So all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally agree with the podcast. It cost me less than $100, and I've been using it. I've had it for 2.5 years, so it's held up, and it was totally worth the investment. So yeah, definitely agree with that.
So the next kind of bucket, and this is a little bit getting into the feels, maybe depending on what you're going to say or share. But on this podcast, like, and similar to yours, of sharing either a personal challenge or professional challenge or some mind meld convoluted connection of both, of maybe something that was really challenging and kind of what you did or some things that you did personally, or what you did or some things that you did personally, or advice to others to kind of overcome a similar situation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is when I decided to make a career change into my current field of work, which is implementing, because it actually did take a while to make that change. So, basically, more or less right out of college, I started working at a very large company, and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with my life, but I started at a relatively lower level, and just sort of over the kind of says that you should do when you're building your career, sort of like on paper, it was kind of the ideal thing that I felt like, we were all supposed to do. And I got to I wouldn't say a high ranking role. I got promoted several times into like still an individual contributor type of role. So I wasn't on that individual contributor role. And I moved teams a couple times. And then what happened was, after several years, I found myself in a role that, was certainly the highest in rank that I achieved. On paper, it looked like I was doing great, that I had this like ideal career, but the role really was not a good fit. First, I kind of felt that early on after taking that first role. So within the first year of being in that role, I kind of knew like, the work is fine, but I really want to decide to make a significant change. And through all my roles that I had been doing in the company, I had done a little bit of training with employees and a little bit of like employee communication. So writing, presentations, executive communications, things like that. So I took stock of what I liked doing and about all my previous roles and said, well, these two things, training and communications, I really like these. So the other, again, trying to follow these. Trying to follow the conventional wisdom of the time was that generally I had always heard that it was much easier to make a switch like that in your career by staying in your same company, as opposed to trying to leave the company and then you go out and you're an unknown, plus you're trying to do something completely new. And I heard that, no, really you should stay at the company and see if you can switch. Like, that shouldn't be too hard. They know you, you've always been a good performer. You've been promoted, of course. Like, how hard could this possibly be?
Famous last words.
Well, it was very hard. So, I communications and, I had some good conversations with hiring managers, recruiters, good interviews. I got really close a few times on a couple roles, but honestly, after maybe I probably to several roles. It's probably been like a year or two of on and off applying. Like, nothing had come to fruition for that. Someone gave me advice to do like informational interviewing. So I was trying to meet people at the company to just, not interview for a job, but like learn about different areas of the company. So you go meet someone, like, tell me about your role and what you do in your job and what's it like and what kind of skills do you look for when you're hiring. So I started doing that. What kind of skills do you look for when you're hiring? So I started doing that. And I think because I'm a project manager at heart, I like to track things. So I made this Excel spreadsheet, and I would track every row would be a new person or a new interaction, just to kind of keep track of who I was meeting with. And again, after several months, kind of keep track of who I was meeting with. And again, after several months, uh, I lost after 100 entries. I just started losing count.
Oh,
So
Lord, you made it that far.
I
My
made it that
goodness.
far, but I really didn't feel like I had anything to show for it because I was having all these conversations that were going well, but not really getting any traction. The conversations that were going well, but not really getting any traction that I was looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, I really knew that I was pretty stuck. So, I wasn't moving where I was. I felt like I couldn't stay where I was long term, but at the same time, I didn't feel like I had the experience to really find the role that I wanted outside of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wanted outside of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, I tried some new things. I mentioned before that I'm very active on LinkedIn. It's where I found a lot of my friends. So around that time was really when I started getting active there. So, obviously a lot of us have profiles there. A lot of people just sort of set it up, set it and forget it. But I'll just like people looking for jobs. It's, people who are building consulting firms, and a lot of employers are out there. So I started
Mm-hmm.
getting active. I started connecting with training managers outside of my company just to learn about what they did and tried to connect into local companies. And, I continued to volunteer at work anytime I could. So I had little bits of my current role that were devoted to that, which I really enjoyed. I also decided to start a grad school program. So I mentioned before that there was a huge gap in time between going to college and going to grad school. So that was
Mm-hmm.
probably about a good 13 years.
There
And
you go.
and it's like I always knew I wanted a good 13 years.
There
And
you go.
and it's like I always knew I wanted to go to grad school, but I'm like, I don't know what I want to do. I'm like, you know what? I think it's time. I think maybe a master's degree in some sort of psychology or learning field could potentially help me get the experience that I need. So I started that while I was there. And I started that while I was there. And I also decided to work with a personal coach because honestly, after several years of applying for jobs, having conversations, just trying to network, and I'm a very shy person. Like seriously, the last thing I want to do is cold call strangers and try to sell.
Seen me before in life, but let me tell you about myself.
Let me tell you what I want from you, person that I just met. It's like that's what it felt like. It's like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, it's the worst. So after it kind of wears on you, and when you
Mm-hmm.
face that much rejection, sometimes it starts to get in your head. So at that point, it's like, you know what, I just need to work with a coach who can help me sort out what I want to do. I was starting to forget.
Sure feel like, yeah.
Yeah, I was like going right down the slide. So, and she was great. She helped me do some inventories of strengths and kind of aligning what I wanted to do. And we even did a visualization exercise of what would your ideal job look like literally everything from of what would your ideal job look like literally everything from you're leaving your house, you drive in your car, what direction do you turn in, what is the drive, like little that level of detail, all the way to what does
Hmm.
the office look like. I'm like, okay, I guess, okay, sure, that's fine. But we did a whole bunch of exercises around that, which actually wound up being very helpful towards the end, and I can circle back with that one in just a minute. But you know, it wound up being I was doing all these different things, and then one day I was told at work that my role very significantly, but in a direction that was completely away from where I was going. So they were taking it into more of like an analyst type of path, and sort of, so like all the training I've been doing, the communications, they're like, we're taking that out of your role. Like literally we really need a more, something different. And they said,
Yeah.
you're good at, basically I had been vocal about looking for something else. So they knew that I was looking. So they're like, you can stay, or you can leave and go on. And they took care of me, so it wasn't quite like that. But we want you to stay, but we understand that
Yeah.
you're really looking for something else. And that
Yeah.
you're really looking for something else. So against all conventional wisdom to like never leave your job without another job immediately lined up, I did make
Mm-hmm.
the decision to leave, which was very scary. I'd never done anything like that. I had always been employed from getting right out of college, and it had been, been employed from getting right out of college, and it had been, many years at that point. Um, but I still continued to work there for a couple of weeks to just wrap things up. So while I was there, very interestingly, while I was still working there, I wound up getting a call from an external recruiter for 10 minutes from my house that was exclusively in employee training, which was like exactly what I wanted to do.
Right.
So, and I wound up interviewing, I got that role. And then basically I was back at work with like almost no gap between the time that I left my previous company and then starting it with this new one. So it just seems like a very odd coincidence, the perfect timing, but I really feel like it's like almost all the hard work and the frustration and the challenges that I had gone through for several years, just trying to get myself ready and put myself out there and just, get ready for this role. It just happened at the perfect time. And then had me do like literally what I had visualized was what I got. Like literally from the direction I turned out of my street to drive there to like what the team was like, what the office looked like. I'm like, okay, this is really freaky. So somehow I actually, that was like one of the first, but yeah, so that worked out. So what I would advise to others is, I was really stuck for a long time, and I would just, and it is challenging if for a long time it kind of wears on you. So, but I would just encourage people to always network. Always network. Job searching is a combination of what you know and who you know, but also who knows you and what you can do. And that's a big piece of networking as well, is that there are a lot of conversations that take place when you're not in the room, about, people looking for, who's be good for this role, or who can I hire to take care of this, or, who's be good for this role, or who can I hire to take care of this. And if you've had those conversations and shown the great work that you can do, people are more likely to think of you when they have a need. I also know what your value proposition is, know what you bring uniquely to the table, what interests you. And then one thing that I wish I had done then, but I do it now, certainly with podcasting, is I think it's always a good idea to create content that showcases what you can do, what your strengths are. So obviously podcasting is something I started doing, but I know a lot of people who write, even again on LinkedIn, write articles, they'll post videos, just any kind of content that you're comfortable with that really showcases who you are and what you can do. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect from the start, but I feel like the more you get yourself out there, the more of that trail of content is out there, it makes you easier to find for people who are really looking for what you can do.
Awesome. That's some good tips. I was listening and writing notes, so always handy.
Perfect.
So how that makes me think of some follow-up questions. So the grad school piece, how was that like going back to school with that large gap? Did you feel like you kind of were quick to adjust back to kind of student life and the student mindset, or what are your thoughts?
I was a little worried that I wouldn't be able to like do school anymore because it had been so long that I was away. But I always liked school. I was always, kind of good at like, reading enormous amounts of material and writing papers and things like that. So I kind of slid right back into it. And it was a really great program. It was designed especially for working professionals. So we had some FaceTime, like every other Saturday we had, like less than an hour from my house. So like early Saturday morning, it's no problem to drive down. There's no traffic, and, you get to meet with people. Plus we also worked online with each other through, I think it's called Blackboard, but they have, all this technology that they didn't have when I went to college is now, it's like, oh, it's so different now. So we had a whole online component as well in terms of completing assignments and having more class discussions there as well. So it was a really nice blend of online and offline. And I met a really great lot of people through there as well. And I actually continued the program while I was in my new role as well. So, I kind of continued through that, and, it was a great support. And I kind of continued through that, and, it was a great support. And when I'm talking about 2 years to graduate, and so now I have my master's, which is, it's been really nice. It's been helpful.
Woohoo. Yeah, that's handy. Yeah, my husband's father is a psychologist as well, and so sometimes we hear entertaining stories about his graduate students. good, bad, or indifferent. Most are usually fine, but sometimes you get some funny, usually younger graduate students that are straight from undergrad into grad school and
Yeah.
kind of there's a balance, right? And you kind of get everybody that runs the gamut, but just seems like the younger ones, quote unquote, has a different mindset in their approach to school versus people who are returning and they're like, look, I have a full-time job, or I'm trying to do this and do school. I'm really focused and a little bit. It's just always interesting stories.
Yeah. Plus, you have a different wealth of experience. So obviously, if you've been out in the workforce, even if it's just a couple of years, you can go back to your job and apply what you learn in class, or you can bring your past experiences to class discussions and apply things. But yeah, when you're straight out of school, you just don't have that experience yet because you've always been in school. So I think it's probably more theoretical. That experience yet because you've always been in school. So I think it's probably more theoretical and that style of learning, I would think.
For sure. That's really good advice. I know that a lot of people go through either by choice or by force, career changes, right? Or by force, career changes, right? Or changes in your career, whether you want to change them or you're forced into it by layoffs or what have you. Kind of a little bit of a combo of yours, a little bit of, hey, we're going to change this role and you want to do something a bit different. That's, I think, some really good advice. So the big buckets I took from that, so the networking piece, so stay connected in your networking, both online and offline. Making sure you're well aware of what your strengths are and also to put any kinds of items out there that'll show what you're able to do and your capabilities to kind of validate that beyond just maybe everyone has a resume and writes a few good bullet points, which is always good, and have somebody who's good at those. But I think even especially actual whatever that you've created examples for, so they can show, you can actually show what you can do. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
This
was fun. I like this interview. This is going to be great.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad I was able to share topics.
For sure. This was good. I think those are the big buckets. So let's tell the folks how they can find your podcast, your social media, if you have one, either if you want to connect personally, that's fine too. But if you want whatever social media pieces you want to share, and that way folks can find you, and I'll put it in the show notes as well.
Okay, perfect. So let's see. So probably the best place you can find me is on my website. That's at www.beyond6seconds.com. You can find all seconds.com. You can find all of my episodes there. If you use another podcast player like, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, you can find all my episodes there as well, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. If you're a fan of Instagram, is at Beyond 6 Seconds. And I know we were talking about podcasting tips before. So if you go to my website, there's a link towards the top that will let you sign up for my free email newsletter, which I'm starting at the beginning of 2020. And if you sign up, you'll get a link right away to my how to get started with podcasting. So it has some more sort of technical recommendations based on my experience. So free gift for signing up for the newsletter if you're interested in doing that.
Woohoo! I will be signing up. I know for sure. That'll be good. So I'll go in there. Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Carolyn, you're on the East Coast, so it's, what is that, 6, 7, 8? Ooh, if I were where you are, it would be nearly my bedtime. Because I get up really early.
It's been dark for like 4 hours because it's winter, so it's just...
Yes, it always throws me. It's dark here, and it's only 5:40 Pacific time. Yeah. And I'm like, I always look like, oh, what, it's got to be.
It's like, no, it's 5 o'clock. Exactly. Like, no, I have to stay up. Can't go to bed.
No, yeah, exactly. You want to go to sleep and get those extra hours in, especially I get up so early. Yeah. Get up at 4 most mornings. Yay. Fun. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Par for the course. So it's all good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and hit then. Thank you and have a good evening. I'm going to hit stop recording.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yay. Bye. So yes, that was Carolyn, and now we'll listen to a little bit from Christine Alexis, who's a social media manager, and talking about getting into marketing, social media, all of that, and then how she's overcome that and her speech impediment, as well as a couple little fun tidbits. Stay tuned, and thanks for listening. So, welcome to the Victory Podcast. I am your host, Monique Watson, and I have the great, grand, wonderful pleasure to have interviewing with me today is Christine Alexis. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Monique. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. I'm so excited that you agreed. Yay, more people agreeing to be podcasted and actually get on the schedule. So it's always challenging. People are like, yeah, I'll be on. So what day do you want to do? Radio silence. So, thank you for agreeing. So maybe you can give a bit, just as for the listeners, kind of a template of where we're going with this interview. So Christine will give a little background about herself, maybe a little bit about how we know each other. And then we'll talk about her career and kind of that career path. And she'll give her a little bit of about her career and kind of that career path. And she'll give her a little bit of advice for folks maybe looking to get into a similar field or that specific field. And then we'll close out with any advice or social media contacts. That's perfect. So Christine, tell the people how you know me and tell a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I've known you since childhood, literally. I actually am good friends with her sister. So we grew up together and I saw you at Ursuline, everything like that. And yeah, so we kind of go way back.
Way back. We're not that old, but right? Your 10-year reunion should be.
Last year, just don't remind me. But yes, it was last year.
Yeah, because you're class of 08.
Yeah.
I always think, oh, that's what it is. My husband is 09 from Stamog. Yeah, so known Christine for a number of years. Seen the little baby grow up. She's become a lovely long lady, a wonderful, wonderful young woman now. And so tell us a little bit about, maybe the people don't know, and kind of, I've introduced myself on this podcast, but a little bit about yourself, like where you grew up and maybe a little background there, kind of your journey, where you grew up and maybe a little background there, kind of your journey to get from maybe not birth, but early life, maybe college, different career, job things, kind of take us on that journey.
Yeah, so I am from New Orleans, born and raised. I went to Ursuline Academy for high school, and then I went to Loyola for college. I studied marketing and I minored in Spanish. I always loved learning about other cultures and stuff like that. So I was fortunate enough to study abroad twice, once in Costa Rica and another time in Peru. Yeah, it was fun. I mean, I had altitude sickness, but that's another story for another day. Yeah, so after that, I worked at the New Orleans Chamber of Commerce in their marketing, and I decided I moved to Miami, and I got my MBA from the University of Miami in marketing and finance. And I began working at the Miami Chamber of Commerce, a museum, and then currently I work at DB Schenker. It's a global supply chain company, and I'm their social media manager, where I speak 3 languages. I just work with people very talented, and so it's kind of like what I do. I'm fortunate enough that they let me travel a lot. I've gotten to interview like foreign diplomats and stuff like that. So it's been a really cool job, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, I've seen, so you and I are friends both in real life and on LinkedIn. And so like I'll see stuff, I was like, oh my God, Christine is like always places and interviewing, and she's so grown up. I just think of you, the little Ursuline girl running around school and campus stuff and wearing your little uniform. I'm like, no, but she's a real adult now. Same thing I think of my sister. I'm like, no, but she's a real adult now. Same thing I think of my sister as 12 years old in my mind forever, but she's a grown up.
I feel like I'm 21 or something. I really don't feel like I'm turning 30. So
I know it's one of those things. Like I had this conversation, and this is a bit of a tangent, but whatever. I had this conversation with someone. It's like I don't know what I thought that this age would feel like, or that I would have done or accomplished at, it as a like high school age. Like, oh, by 25, I'll do this. I'll be done having all my kids,
right.
married, done, bing, bam, boom. I'm just living life, and you're like, who I was at 25, who I was dating at the time, even to think, okay, would I have like kids with that person? No, hard pass. So yeah, it's just interesting the things you plan for your life at a young age. Some things are good, like to plan and to have like if you want to go to like an advanced degree, medical school, law school, thinking those things, kind of having that plan, and if that you still want it, then continue to do that. But certain things, like especially personal life, you're like, I had this image of what I would do at a certain age, and then I'm like, it was different, but it's actually still good. Like I'm good with where I'm at.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
definitely. But
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
but
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, so you mentioned you went to grad school and getting into kind of this marketing space. So how maybe if I'm Susie Q, and I really like marketing as an idea, and the kind of maybe some of the differences of marketing as an idea, and the kind of maybe some of the differences of how getting into social media marketing, how is it different? And if I'm interested in really on that side, because maybe I'm really into social media, want to transfer that into a career in a sense. What are some tips or tricks you would say, or advice you would give to Susie Q who's looking into, or tricks you would say, or advice you would give to Susie Q who's looking into that?
so social media, I want to say there's multiple areas, but there's like when people think of social media, they're like, oh my goodness, it's like this like sexy career, like like we're like like working with like influencers and stuff like that, which is true. It's true. You do like the fun side of things, but what people don't know is that like you have to manage a budget. You have to know the data side. Like, I have to tell people like, okay, this is where your money is going, and this is what I've done for you for like with this amount of money and stuff. So for social media, I would recommend if you have like a friend who wants to be like this like Instagram, it would be good portfolio because you need like a body of work for sure, but you also need to show a return. Like how am I producing for somebody?
And do you think, or have you come across, so you went to school for marketing both in undergrad and then a focus on that with your master's. Do you think, or have you run across people in your career and kind of anything advice with that?
Yeah, so my boss actually, she majored in international business. So it was a different path, but it kind of led her to the same area. For business degrees, it's like one of the beauties of majoring in business is that you can kind of switch and move around and stuff. Like I have a degree in finance and marketing, so it really just depends. But I would definitely look into that. Also, for social media in particular, as I mentioned, I've done like interviews with diplomats and stuff like that. I don't have formal media training. So a lot of people now are doing broadcast journalism and switching to social media because they want you to have a camera present, the comm side, and kind of move over. It just depends.
Cool.
Cool. I feel like I was rambling.
No, I think it's good. So for the podcast, I'd rather have a lot of content and then splice and dice and can edit back. So if you feel like you're rambling, that's fine. I edit back. So if you feel like you're rambling, that's fine. My goal as the interviewer, and it may be different versus the diplomat, you're kind of focused and keeping it brief on your questions and allowing them to be the one. But as being now the flip side, right? You're the one being interviewed. You're like, wait, my mind is like the interviewer I'd rather from a podcast perspective have a lot of content to go through, so that we can edit out those kind of flubs or whatever makes sense, and then because you're editing it versus more live is more succinct and
right.
and thought process out. So since there's editing, and maybe we can talk about this. You can tell me if you don't feel comfortable talking about it. And I don't think whether I included this on the outline, but another phase of the podcast. So we talk about career stuff, but the idea of the Victory podcast is people who have overcome something, whether that's career changes, either advancements just in their career and kind of it be I've in the first half of episode 4 that I just released, where I talked about my Katrina story and included tips and tricks about emergency response. I wasn't sure if there was something for you either as a New Orleans native that you want to talk about maybe your Katrina story, or some New Orleans native that you want to talk about maybe your Katrina story, or some other kind of maybe on the personal side of something that you went through, whether that be, we've talked about grief on different episodes. So they run the gamut as far as examples in previous episodes, that maybe that's something a little bit more personal that you've gone through, and tips and advice that help you, through that process. And now that you're on the other side, things you would tell yourself in that process.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure you know this, but for me, with growing up, I actually have a speech impediment.
I did not know this.
Yeah, I've been in speech therapy
I did not know this.
Yeah, I've been in speech therapy pretty much my entire life, from the age of 4 through high school. So working in media, it's scary at times for me, but something I had to definitely work on because I wanted a career like this. So having to like speak at press conferences, and then like they put me on the spot sometimes. I'll have to speak in Spanish where I really stumble at that point, or something like that. So for me, that was kind of, for my career at least, that's like one of the biggest, I guess, obstacles I've had to overcome. So I don't think I overcame it, but it's like a work in progress. But
yeah, so I think maybe life with struggling with the speech impediment, what are some memories you have of like situations that were maybe particularly challenging, that you can just like, oh, I remember when I was in X class and this happened and it really was frustrating. And then one of the things that maybe something you remembered from.
Yeah, I don't know about early in life, but I know for sure like one major thing was in grad school, they have a rule that like you cannot get a C. Like if you get a C, you have to go to like this council and what's what I'm looking for? Like
It's like kind of. Yeah, it's a bit like a C is an F in grad school. It's a bit like a C is an F in grad school.
It's like an
basically.
F.
Yeah.
Well, one of our classes was speech class, and it wasn't like a regular speech class like you take in high school or something. It's like, no, there's cameras looking at you. The entire class is grading you, and this is for like a semester long, and you have to give these speeches not for like a 2-minute speech long, and you have to give these speeches not for like a 2-minute speech, but like a 15-minute speech, in depth about like the weirdest stuff. So for me, for grad school, I remember I had to give a speech, and I'll usually do pretty well if I don't memorize it. But I had to memorize this one. It was like a blanked. It's because I knew I was going to start stuttering. For me, it was something like, oh my God, like I thought like I at least didn't overcome it, but I thought that I got better at it, or I would not be in this predicament. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm going to fail this speech. I'm not going to, I'm going to have to go to this board and petition. And my grade was like a B something. And then I went back and like redid the entire speech for the class, because it was just something that, regardless of if my grade were going to change or not, it was something that I wanted to prove to myself that I could do. But for me, that was something that was like, I never knew that would still impact me to this level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned it, and as you were talking, I was thinking, also listening to what you're saying, and then I remembered, and I'll maybe put a link to this article. There's been a lot with the presidential races going on, and Joe Biden has talked a lot about his history going on, and Joe Biden has talked a lot about his history with speech impediment, right? Mm-hmm. And there was an article written by, I think it was, I want to say a New York Times or Washington Post, one of those like nationally news things. And it was a person who also has a speech impediment. And it was written And it was written in an interesting way, talking about a lot of what have been associated with either age or whatever, these pauses that Joe will say, or word flubs, or those kind of moments can possibly be kind of linked back to still coping with, because you don't, as you said, even grad school is X number of years since, birth, right? And you have a speech impediment. You kind of manage it. You learn skills and tools and tips and tricks to help cope with that, and especially in non-practice, like practice the responses or the thoughts or whatever. And just, it was an interesting article about that relative to some of his performances in a debate setting and these kind of pauses. And I think it was some of the writer especially also suffers from a speech impediment.
To read it. I mean, I do have coping mechanisms for sure. Like I'll think of synonyms. If I can't pronounce the word, like at that moment, I'll quickly think of like another word to say it. But then for that particular incident, I completely blanked.
Yeah, I'll send you that just in an FYI. I thought it was interesting. I personally have not personally had any speech impediments things. I actually probably talk too much, but that's fine, and have no problem with being put on the fly. But I understand that can be a challenge for people, even if you don't have a speech impediment, just people's comfort with responding, thinking, processing, processing, and responding in a way that's coherent and makes sense for other people is a challenge. And it was actually something that came up I'm working on training for an unconscious bias workshop that I'll be co-hosting on Friday. Yay, fun. No, it'll be good. But it was something around biases, around how people even learn. If you think about, some people learn and really need to process the information, take it in, digest it. And so allowing to send out like pre-read to a meeting. So like how I sent you an outline, I realized like things like that. So you can think about how I'm going to respond on their questions or replies are more thoughtful, or can be. At least we've given them that opportunity to have the information beforehand. So I've been more aware after going through this unconscious bias workshop and prepping to give it myself of those kind of things as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting to stutter. And he was saying it was something he struggled with his entire life. And it was very interesting to me that he is this far along. Like, it was kind of inspirational to me, I guess, that he came this far. He is doing like national media interviews and everything like that. So it's interesting to see how people progress in the career path you chose, like what you've been through with everything, and this is where you're going with it. But yeah.
I think it's important and really actually inspiring, Christine, because honestly, and as we shared earlier, I've known you for a long period of time. It's not, I mean, that's at the high school level, remember you said since 4 to for a long period of time of having a speech therapist. So I never noticed, but doesn't mean you still struggle with it. And it's very inspiring to say that not only, okay, you're going to, from a practical everyday life perspective, to say, okay, I've now managed this speech impediment to be conversationally comfortable and all those, this speech impediment to be conversationally comfortable and all those kind of things. But then to take it to the steroided version, like you said, in your career path, right? So now you're not only just talking to people in a meeting because you do X, Y, and Z in marketing, because you could have easily stepped into the space of print marketing, right? So you do print marketing, you kind of stay at a computer, do some graphic design, work with graphic designers, print, digital, kind of in that space away from cameras and people and interviewing and conversations, right? But you instead said, nah, I'm good. Let's do the camera side and interviewing. In this case, now you're moving to diplomats with native language plus the speech impediment plus sometimes responding to maybe their back questions, even though the plus side is you're the interviewer, so you kind of can set the tone and plan of where you want to take the interview. But yeah, that's interesting / inspiring. That's really cool, actually. Rockstar Christine. Now this I'm going to ask you, and I didn't include it, but it just came to my mind, and I wanted to ask someone else because my sister and I had a discussion. I don't know if you saw, so for the listeners, we attended the same high school, all girls Catholic school, different class mascots. And you may know where I'm going, different class mascots. And you may know where I'm going with this because Nicole and I had different opinions, but sort of came to the same conclusion ultimately. Thoughts on, so we had a class mascot, and so Christine and I had the same, it's a quick 30-second version of rotating class. Yeah, it's a quick 30-second version of
Yeah.
rotating class. Yeah, it's kind of, you have to explain it, set it up, and then get into it. So rotating class names, that a senior class passes that class name down to the freshman class, and they take on that name when they become sophomores. It's been going on for decades. They've had the name that we share, the Sioux, named after the Sioux. They've had the name that we share, the Sioux, named after the Sioux Indians or Native Americans or indigenous people, whatever category we're going to go with, for several years, several decades, probably since 50s, if not further back. And recently they've taken where they're going to change and retire the Sioux name, just given the political implications of using indigenous people cultures as a mascot and an ideal, which I get. And I would be curious, and take your time to ponder and think, because I can always edit the long pause if you, and kind of, I don't know if they came out with a next name of what the new name is yet that I've seen.
They told me, but I forgot. I want to ask Nicole. It's the Phoenix.
Oh yeah, I did see that. I was like, cool, because then you can keep the red. That was my first thought about that. So what are your thoughts on, one, them changing the name and the implications of that? Because there was a mixed, and I'm sure you saw some of the social media response from our fellow alumni on that announcement from the school. And then what do you think the new name would be, the other side?
I'm very conflicted. I actually discussed this with other people. We were in this group chat with like Nicole and everybody. We discussed this with other people. We were in this group chat with like Nicole and everybody talking about it and stuff. I just feel like it was long overdue. I feel like it probably was offensive a long time ago. And what took you guys so long? But then I also feel like what prompted you? Because you didn't think of this on your own. Did somebody like push you to do this? Or was there a situation where it was brought to your attention from a donor or something like that? Like how was the issue like brought up? So I do agree that it should be removed, but I feel like we should not have been at the school when that was happening in the first place.
I concur.
Yeah,
And
one last thing. I got very offended. I was extremely offended. They asked a classmate of ours to speak on it, and she said that we took Native American history classes regarding the Sioux, like we learned about it, and everything like that. And for me, I mean, I don't know if I missed school for those days or where I was, but I never learned about that culture. So it wasn't as if it were taught to us in a way that we should learn about it and understand it and, pay homage to. Kind of like, I don't see them being genuine with it. Long overdue. I don't know. I honestly forgot how Nicole felt about it, but
she was a little bit like, okay, but what are we? I think I have to go back and look at my text, because I think probably in the same, like, my email that heavily, and then I read it and I was like, I get it. I agree to your point of what took so long. This is not new. Nicole's points, some of her points were around, we did have the Sioux prayer that we thought was pretty non-offensive. Right? There was a Sioux prayer. There was a thing. So I think there was attempts to kind of make that connection. And I think one of our teachers, I won't say his name for the lack of, I haven't had the conversation to screen that he should be on here, did try and infuse indigenous people, the Sioux history, into their history lesson.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where that point was. But no, we didn't have a special class for it. I think it's one of those things that I feel, yes, it can help, but some of the cheers, if you look back and you print out the lyrics and some of the dance moves, I'm like, I could see instantly, just visually, not with the intent. I think the intent was never to be offensive, right? Versus the Redskin, the actual intent of the word is even like offensive. There is straight up offensive, like use of the N-word with a hard R.
Right.
And then there's, I didn't know I was culturally appropriating something. There's kind of in this spectrum. And in the middle is, it is offensive because we didn't show it the proper respect, cultural recognition and all that is due, but I can see why people have a love, just because of change is hard for people, and a love for a name. So yeah, they did. There was many of people. I don't know if you saw some of the stuff from my class. Woo! Some folks felt very passionate. Woo! Some folks felt very passionate.
I took pride in it. I took pride in what we represented for that, like what our class represented. Yeah. But I understand why. But yes, that should have been handled a long time ago, honestly.
I concur. And I think there is a problem.
How come the Sioux? How come they didn't choose a
That was my thing. Like, why weren't we the Homa?
Right.
Because that's the most popular, as far as off the top of my head, indigenous people for Louisiana. Yeah, I don't know.
It just didn't make sense to me. But I mean, it's sad that it's gone. The Phoenix name, I feel like the girls could have probably done a little better with it. But
so this was where I thought it sticks and it fits. And I'd be interested to see what the new cheers happen to be and all that side of it. It's not perfect, but since we already have the little sister name of the Red Feathers, it fits, dovetails well into that.
But it just makes me wonder why all of a sudden.
For the school institution or anyway, so I express my next opinion, somebody threatened some money.
Yeah,
somebody brought it to their attention, and I think it was probably has been brought up, but it was, if it's just a parent saying whatever, then there's some level of like, okay, then sure, fine. And then I think, and then new blood, new fresh eyes, that may be an awareness. And then I think in the growing years that have happened over the last like 5 years, the increase in social media response, presence, and repercussions for brands in general, let alone a school, I think now changes that dynamic.
I mean, I'll tell you, their social media presence is very nice. I follow them. I'm like, oh, the girls.
I do. They've stepped it up.
Did a great job. But
yeah, who does theirs? Do you know?
I have no idea.
It's good. I like it. I follow them on the gram. Like it. I follow them on the gram. That's what I agree. There's definitely a prompting behavior. It doesn't just out of the goodness of maybe some level of that. Maybe it was an awareness. Someone brought it up and it was an aha to say, okay, this is the time. And I think because that class graduating, I think the senior class or junior going into senior class, it's a time to do it because this is the time to make that change. And it's not and people who are very upset about it, the arguments I saw online from people whose names I shall not mention because they have not given their consent to participate in the podcast, were like, oh, it was such a proud history. We respect it. I was like, and I get that. I was like, but just like with anything else, if you look over the spectrum of time, things that were offensive were not offensive. We grow, we learn, we change, and realize and have the epiphany for whatever reasons that they are now offensive and we should change. Right. They used to have the class name. I don't know if it was ours, old class or whatever. The Rebels was a name for one of the classes. Okay. Yeah, back in the day. And that changed at some point.
We can phase that out. I mean, if it were that big of a deal, then why not just go to the Sioux tribe, explain what you've done, explain the history classes that you claim we were taught, and ask them for permission if we're doing it as a way to honor that particular culture, that group.
Yeah, I would think that we would run into some challenges. With the actual content of some of the things to be fully considered.
But I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Oh, 100%.
This thing that's not offensive, then why don't you go straight to the source?
Exactly. I don't think it's worth their time, not worth their time. Great to establish a relationship from indigenous people and whatever, but I think you really don't have have both legs to stand on.
No, of course, but think about if they did forge this bond with them, they could do their service trips. The Sioux class could go to the Sioux reservation and do service over there, or do something where they could learn more.
Yep, and that was the argument that on social media started in the comment section on stuff was people's commentable, what about Florida State and the Seminoles? I was like, right. Well, and there is that the Seminoles, Florida State and Seminole tribes have a relationship. They have established, like you've said, of like on now what the deep dive into it. Florida State had a whole article. I read through some of it, but they have an established relationship. So the use of the Seminole tribe and their, first of all, they don't have like a person, an arrow or something like that. That's their like imagery, so it's not that way offensive. So yeah, that establishment in that same vein has been done. So
correct. I mean, I'm just saying, as somebody living in Florida, I think I know more about the Seminole tribe than the Sioux tribe, which should say something.
Correct.
Tribe than the Sioux tribe, which should say something.
Correct. As a non-native
right.
Floridian, you're a transplant and temporarily located. Yeah, exactly. So they could have done the Sioux, or they could have done the Homa or whatever. But they've landed on Phoenix. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
They'll find some fun as long as they need to start winning again. That's what we need to talk about. That's the real deal. But okay. So I think we've covered a little more than what we outlined, but that's okay. And I'll probably keep in the Sioux stuff because I think it's topical, and there's a lot of institutions across different sports that have changed their mascot. One that has not and still remains and is probably the most visible is the Redskins. But they said they're not changing it. IDK. Not my team. Born in Virginia. To each their own. People still buying the ticket, so we'll see. One day. Maybe. Probably not. All right. Well, Christine, this has been fun to catch up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope it wasn't too boring. But
no, it was really good.
Wasn't too boring. But
no, it was really good. You had really good stuff. I took some notes, and I'll try and include some information. So are you, just to wrap up, is there a way that folks can reach out to you via social media? Is that something you're open to, or do you kind of have a public, private open to, or do you kind of have a public, private?
I should know this. This is so embarrassing. So I have an Instagram. It's Christine Alexis _ So
the underscore's at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I follow you. So I'll when I post the notes, and that's probably the best way to reach out to you if people are like, I have marketing questions. I want to break into marketing. You're so awesome, Christine.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Cool. Also, I'll make sure to share that in the show notes. Well, thank you, Christine, for agreeing to be interviewed. And yeah, so have a good rest of your evening. I'm going to stop the recording now. So, thanks again for tuning in for episode 5. And as always, I'm on Twitter at The Victory Pod. That will keep you in the loop on upcoming episodes and different topics that come up. And share our podcast with your friends and family. If you found it interesting, share it along. If you even don't like it, but you want to tell people how terrible it is, go ahead and share it anyway. Thanks again. And as I always sign up, every problem has a solution. It's whether we're willing to do the work to find it. Let's do the work and be victorious. Bye-bye.